I was just learning we're going to self-introduce.
Oh, great.
So my name's Tom Friedman. No, my name's David Brooks. I'm the poor man's version of Tom Friedman. I'm New York Times columnist and chair of Weave from the Aspen Institute. So that's my connection to here, which I'm very proud of, and is going great guns ever since I stopped being executive director of it. Fareed probably needs no introduction, which is why you're here. It occurred to me, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I have a memory of you, me, and David Frum in a taxi at about age 20. And I think you were still in school. Mm-hmm. So if that taxi had crashed and we'd all died, American media would be in much better shape.
I remember it well, and but you were guys who had already made it, and so it was a very aspirational taxi ride for me.
Okay, well, we felt the
opposite. By the way, I'm sorry if I'm late. I subscribe to the Larry Summers principle of life, which is if you've never missed a flight, you're spending way too much time at airports.
Okay. So Fareed, you know, has a show on CNN called GPS. He writes a column for the Washington Post. He is on various lists of top 10 global thinkers. And he had a book come out called Age of Revolutions, which is going to be the foundation for what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to coach it in the largest subject about you. So you're a foreign policy writer, a prominent, mostly foreign policy writer. The world is in the state it's in today. How do you see your mission now, and how does this book fit into that mission?
It's a great question, David, because it does relate very much to my central kind of preoccupation, because it feels to me like we are at a real turning point in history. I know people say this all the time, but let me explain why. Ever since 1945, we entered a kind of fundamentally different world order in which the United States, along with European allies, decided we're trying to, and this was Franklin Roosevelt's idea very determinedly during World War II, we're going to try to create a different kind of international system without these constant wars between the richest, most powerful countries in the world. And we are going to try to do it in a way that allows for an open economy, free trade. Everyone, can move, can plug and play in this world economy, and that project has largely succeeded. In fact, remarkably succeeded. Give you one simple data point: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the attempt to extinguish a country using conquest, is extraordinarily rare. There are basically no examples of it since 1945. That's why it is such an assault on the international system and the international order. Before 1945, every 2 years it happened. I mean, France and Germany fought 3 wars in the 100 years, 75 years before 1945, and they annexed and traded territory all the time. So this is something really extraordinary that has been built. And, frankly, from 45 to 89, it was almost like you built a part of that open free world because the communist world never entered. And then you expanded it dramatically after 1989, and it began to encompass the whole world. And that fundamental order is under threat. And it's under threat partly because we have gone from a kind of period of American unipolarity, which was unique in world history, and we can talk about that, but to the return of great power politics, the return of great power challengers, the return of great power tension in the world. It's not an accident if you look around. What you notice is now, there are 3 places that the global system is being deeply stressed: the Russian assault on Ukraine, the Iranian assault on the American Middle Eastern order. So the Russian assault is on the European security system. The Iranian is on the Middle Eastern security system, and the Chinese, which is more of an economic push to replace the United States and as a result upend the Asian security system. All of them are systemic challenges, obviously the Iranian one being a smaller one, but that's what's fundamentally different about the world we live in. That is going to utterly transform the world in a way that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all the gangs of thugs could never do. And when thinking about that, what I realized was that central challenge of that world order, of maintaining that world order, maintaining this open international system, is that we've lost faith in it ourselves. And at the center of it, it's the United States that has lost faith in it. And that worries me enormously. And we have lost faith in it because there is a kind of illiberal populism that is raging through the Western world that doesn't really think, that doesn't think much of this liberal project, this Enlightenment project. I think in many ways is pocketing all the gains without realizing that you have to pay a price and that there is a certain, structure that has to be maintained. So in a sense, I did come to it outside in, though I began to think about it at the time the Tea Party started up, because I didn't think America would fall prey to this. The United States has had debates about about how to be engaged in the world, not whether to be engaged in the world, and we are now having that debate.
Yeah. So you see yourself as one of those on the side of defending this liberal order and reminding it why it's lovable.
Yep, very much so. Very much so.
Now, in the book, you make it clear. Sometimes we use these words that really they have as much music as me crawling on gravel. It's like we need to defend the rules-based international order. Like, it doesn't exactly make the heart sore, the rules-based international. But one of the nice things you do in the book is you emphasize that liberalism isn't just like John Stuart Mill sitting alone in a room thinking. It's an actual way of life. And you locate two beautiful civilizations in the Netherlands, which gave us tulips, and Britain, which gave us football hooligans. No, I'm just kidding. But to describe how, especially these two countries, are representative of what was created really through liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a very good point. Bono tells me that what we should be doing is we should be coming up with songs to the European Union and the liberal international order. And I tell him, you're the songwriter. Figure out a way to make this poetic.
The Edge told me that was bullshit. We shouldn't do that.
He does at his concerts, by the way, fly the flag of the European Union at points. So, if you ask yourself, what is this liberal project? In a way, you ask exactly the right question, because the way to think about it is historically. How did we come about it? So if you look at average income around the world, we have, believe it or not, pretty good data for about 2,000 years. For about 1,600 of those years, it's a flat line. It's basically about $300 per capita GDP. It's basically what you could make with agriculture. And you had occasional tiny blips because some country would conquer another country and steal their gold, and that was basically it. And then around the 17th century, you start to see an upward trajectory, which then turns into a hockey stick graph, and it goes way up. So we're now at about $6,000 per capita GDP. Average income in the world, US is 70,000. But why did that happen, and when did it happen? It happened in the 17th century, and it began with the Dutch. And the Dutch were the first country to begin to think about how to innovate rather than plunder, rather than to extract. And they did this because they were forced to. They were living on the most non-arable land in Europe. They had to reclaim the land from the sea. They had to work together to do it. They had to invent mechanisms and technologies of water management and agriculture. That then leads them to invent tall ships and compasses and things like that. Then they invent modern globalization as we know it. They have financial innovations. They create the first joint stock company, the Dutch East Indies Company. They invent the first stock market. And they become by the end of the 17th century, the richest country in Europe. Amsterdam is 4 times richer per capita GDP than Paris, which was the great kind of agrarian power. And in doing this, they realize, and I think you're exactly right, it's not just John Stuart Mill or even Spinoza thinking these things. They realize that the way they are working and working well is by empowering individuals, by having a very flat, decentralized mode of government. They didn't have, forget a king, they didn't even have a president or a prime minister. They just had a variety of local officials who came together in a parliament of sorts. And that model of decentralized, individualistic, they realized that they needed to be tolerant because talented people were coming from all over the place and fleeing many of the religious wars, the Inquisition and the Counter-Inquisition. And they built the most powerful country in the world. And then through a kind of strange accident of history, the model gets imported to Britain. You may remember the British are going through a kind of a period of trying to figure out whether they were going to be Catholic or Protestant. And that became a code for whether or not they would have the French model of modernization, which was high centralization, or the Dutch model, which was high decentralization. And the British think they were never conquered ever since the Norman conquest, but they were actually. They invited William of Orange to come and take over Britain. So there was a kind of friendly takeover of the country. William of Orange, this Dutch king, comes and implants these Dutch ideas in Britain. And then Britain becomes the world's first superpower. And that's why we're all speaking English and wearing these clothes.
Yeah, and it wasn't only the ships. It was Rembrandt and it was Shakespeare. It was Dickens changes the imagination of
exactly
of Britain.
Rembrandt is the first great painter to paint not paintings of God and religious scenes, but of rich people. It's the first time the people.
A lot of fans here.
And that it was in a way part of the celebration of individualism, and you point to I suppose we'll come back to this, but you forget what a break with history this was. This was a world in which you were ruled by kings and by dogma and religion and religious authority. You were told what to do. You had no leeway. The individual had very little autonomy or dignity, and that was the break.
Yeah. So we have the advance from, say, the Netherlands to England to U.S. across the world, and we get to the point where I'm a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in the 1990s, and I'm assigned. They said cover this part of the world from Ireland to Vladivostok, from Iceland to Cape Town. So that was my beat. And I actually did a hell of a job because I saw the reunification of Germany, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the Oslo peace process in the Middle East, the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Russia. And I covered nothing but good news for about 5 years. And my son, he was one of those kids who didn't sleep well. You had to drive him around. And so I'd put him in the back of the car from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and I'd drive up and down the West Bank, Ramallah, Hebron, Nablus. Like, you could not do that today, but there were no checkpoints. It seemed, if you recall, the Oslo process, peace was at hand. So I'd like you to get a little more granular. We're on that glide path, and I should add that China is going capitalist and reducing poverty by leaps and bounds. What's the Battle of Jena? What's the thing that tips it?
So if you think about what happens after 1989, which is really one of the great seismic events in history, you remember this, and I think most of the people in this audience will remember, unless there are some very young people who I'm not noticing. When I tell a joke, and sometimes when speaking about Johnny Carson, and you go on college campuses, and they think you're talking about ancient Rome. So what happens in 1989 is the contest, Fukuyama was right. There was a kind of contest as to which direction was history going to go. And, I see Indra in the audience. Indra and I grew up in India. India was part of that. Like, even in a place like India, there was this question of, are we going to go in this direction? Are we going to go, is it going to be more like the American model, more like the Soviet model? Every country was grappling with that. And in 1989, the debate was over. And as a result of that, you entered a world that was really probably unique in world history, in that it was a world with only one great power. Not since Rome were you in that. Think of 1995, when you're out there doing this. China is 1.5% of global GDP. The United States is 27%. Russia its economy has been contracting for 5 years. It contracted from 1990 to 1996 by 50%. More than it contracted during World War II. Who else has left? Germany and Japan exist under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. They're not going to challenge the United States for hegemony. So there was nobody else. And the United States, as a result, was able to, in some ways unintentionally and unwittingly, shape the global environment to an extent that no country has ever been able to. So when we looked at that world you're describing and saying, hey, look at what I'm seeing marketization, every country from India to China adopting free markets, liberalization of trade all over the world, everyone's entering the free trade system, democratization everywhere. Think about 1985, every Latin American country is run by a military junta. By 1995, other than Cuba, they've all turned into liberal democracies or democracies of some kind. 45 elections in Africa in the 1990s. And then you have the open technology revolution and information, which binds everybody together and suddenly seems like we're all part of this new borderless world. What we didn't realize was it was all resting on American power. That it was not, this is not the natural expression of how every country wanted to organize themselves. It may be the natural expression of how every human being wants to, but that's a separate issue. And what started to happen over the last 10 years is that the underlying architecture that allowed for this world that you were describing of good news starts to crack. And it starts to crack because the United States power gets, delegitimized with Iraq and Afghanistan. American economic power gets delegitimized with the 2008 global financial crisis. And American political power gets delegitimized with the rise of populism and illiberalism. And so all of a sudden, you're in a world where there are new great powers rising, and they don't feel that they have to, pay homage to the American-led project. And now they're all, in various ways, trying to erode it. Even when they don't have clear ideas of what they want to do themselves, they know one thing. This system was built and sustained by the United States, and the US and the Americans dominate it, and that's what we don't like. That's what unites Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and the mullahs in Iran.
Okay. Can I give you a different version? Mm-hmm. As usual, you think in terms of power, and I think in terms of culture. And so I would say that liberalism is a beautiful system, and I'm an ardent liberal, and it really celebrates individual choice, that people should have the right to, and have the dignity to choose their own lives. It also celebrates tolerance. It abhors cruelty. And so it's involved in all sorts of moral advances. But liberalism is a system based on individual choice that rests on institutions that precede choice. And the things that really make us who we are things that we didn't choose. It's our family. It's some sacred place we love. It's a faith, or it's a sense there's a cohesive moral order in the universe. That if slavery is not wrong, nothing's wrong. That kings sense that there is a moral order to the universe. And liberalism rests upon these covenantal organizations or institutions that are precede choice. And there's a great thing in psychology that all of the best form of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And so liberalism is really good at daring explorations, but it has a tendency to undermine the secure base. And so the sense that my family, I'm covenantally attached to my country or to my town or to my neighborhood, to my faith, to my moral order, to my civilization, which has a certain coherence to it. Suddenly, a lot of people around the world think, well, family structures are falling apart. A sense of moral meaning is falling apart, and meaning is really way more important than prosperity. And my civilization as a coherent culture is falling apart. And so they feel, with good reason, existentially insecure, that you can't have a decent society if the foundation is not secure. And so when people ranging from Modi, frankly, to Trump, to, you name it, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Marine Le Pen, like these people are all over the world, they are saying faith, family, flag, and moral cohesion. And I'm supplying you the things that are actually more important than whether you have 6 brands of toothpaste to choose from.
So, as you know, the whole last chapter of the book tries to grapple with this problem, and that I basically call sort of filling the hole in the heart that liberalism leaves. And I think you're absolutely right, and you articulate it very well. It's in some ways, as you know, the problem is as old as liberalism itself. In the 1960s, I think the single best book written on this was by the Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell, who wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And the title, in a sense, tells you what the book is about. And he talks about these politicians, he's thinking of kind of right-wing Reaganite politicians, who in the first half of their speech celebrate capitalism, and in the second half of their speech celebrate tradition, community, and religion, not realizing that the first half is undermining the second half, that that there is a central tension between the idea of just efficiency, do whatever it takes, maximize profit, with all these pre-rational, pre-market institutions and norms that uphold it. And so I agree with you. I would put it differently for this reason. I think the great challenge of liberalism is that people want both. Whenever they are given a choice, people want the individualism, they want the autonomy, they want the freedom. Maybe this is because of where we grew up. I grew up in India in a socialist system. And everybody thought Indians were comfortable with this kind of what was called the Hindu rate of growth. And they were not particularly market-oriented. And then you just changed policies in the 1990s, and Indians are now the most rapacious capitalists in the world, right? But they want to combine it with their tradition, with a certain sense of family and all of that, and people now look at that and say, see, they combine it beautifully. It's early. We'll see what happens when the children's children, you know what I mean? That there's an erosion that takes place. Exactly the same thing happened in China. China seemed the most collectivist place in the world in 1979-80. And then they changed policy, and now it's completely berserk. I mean, I remember going in the mid-1990s, and I was saying to one of my hosts who was taking me around, I said, maybe it was the late 1990s, I said, I want to go, we were going to the National Museum in Beijing, and it was all expats, all Americans there. And I said, so where are the Chinese people? He said, the Chinese people are not in the National Museum, they're at the LVMH store. Because in a sense, everybody wants that, and you see that more when people have that liberalism, have that liberty, individualism, autonomy, choice, market taken away from them. So, I mean, look at us today, right? We all bemoan the absence of community, and people talk about the erosion of religion. Well, the churches wouldn't be empty if people just went on Sunday, right? I mean, it's like the thing everybody talks about, independent bookstores are pillars of communities, right? They'd be there if you didn't go home and click on Amazon every time you buy a book. Our actions, voluntary actions, undermine this, and we are searching for a way to do both. And I think that's the tension of liberalism, not that people, because it's not difficult to forsake it. It's your free choice. You can go back to the shtetl if you want, right? Nobody's stopping you. The reason these things are breaking down is because people are choosing to leave the small towns in America and go to the 20 big metro areas because there is economic opportunity. Nobody's forcing them. They can stay in Dubuque. Not that I've got anything against Dubuque.
First, as you reminded, my wife Ann is back there, we were in Hong Kong during the protests, and it was the only time where I asked somebody, where do I find the protests today? And the guy said, well, go to Gucci and turn left to Ferragamo. And then, I'm just going to push back on one thing. It's easy to say people are just choosing not to go to church. But when people have totally lost trust in each other and into the institutions, and there has been just a breakdown in a shared moral order, churches are going to seem unattractive and impossible because you just don't trust your neighbors. So I would say that's one thing. And then the people in Dubuque, a lot of people are in Dubuque, and they are staying because they have their extended family there, but taking Dubuque as a model, there's just no jobs there. But they're still staying because it turns out their family is more important than their career ladder. So I do think it's not quite right to always say that people given the choice between go-go capitalism and a life of stability and community will always choose that. I mean, there's a reason the average American lives 18 miles from where they were born. And that I do think, I'm not sure I would paint it as a one-way trip.
No, it's a struggle. I mean, I give you a match your anecdote with one of mine, which my daughter here.
Data. I call them data.
Yeah. No, two anecdotes. two anecdotes are data. You know this as a journalist. my daughter would be horrified if I were to admit this, but she's 16 now. When she was about 8 or 9, this is my youngest child, she got very into the idea that she wanted to be raised in a religious tradition. I grew up Muslim, not observant at all. My wife is Episcopalian, not observant, like most Episcopalians. It doesn't interfere with her religion or politics. And so she says, I want to do that. One of her best friends at school was a very devout Episcopalian or Presbyterian, I think. And she starts going to church. And she comes back after about doing it for about 6 months. She's sort of, I notice, is not doing it much anymore. I said, so what happened? She said, well, it just sounds like a bunch of fairy tales. And I think that, that's in some way the biggest problem with, which is that we have developed these highly analytic, rational minds. Bertrand Russell used to say, the things that we can understand in the universe we call science, and the things we can't we call religion. And I think there is some, that's part of the story here. It's very difficult, particularly if you want to be, you have to think of it as a metaphor. You don't really think Moses parted the Red Sea, right? I mean, it becomes hard.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm underestimating you.
Yeah, I'm a guy who lived in atheist science, and I was like, that's kind of meager. I want something a little more intellectually complicated. I'm not. We can go off on the war of the religions. Let me ask you a question I've always wondered about. So we have this horribly crusty white Protestant establishment between, say, from 1900 to 1921, the presidency was occupied by Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Then from 33 to 45, it's occupied by Harvard. And then Harry Truman obviously didn't go to college, but he was surrounded by all these guys that are part of they went to Groton and Chode. And so they're just a bunch of smug white male guys from a very tiny sliver of American society. And they produced, under their leadership, the progressive era victory in World War I and World War II, the New Deal, the post-war international order, NATO, not bad. And then we do something wonderful, which is we throw open the door to opportunity to a wide variety of people. Harvard and Yale are no longer finishing schools for C+ mediocrities. They're like supercharged, really smart people. And so we produce a new elite, and so which we call the best and the brightest. And we get Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the financial crisis. It's a genuine puzzle to me that we made the meritocracy, we made the ruling class way more diverse, way more fair, way smarter, way more fun to talk to. People who would have an Indian guy or a Jewish guy in their dining room. And yet, I'm not sure the results are there. So how do you compare the leadership classes of that era with today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there are two responses I would have. The first is, don't forget that those same elites did preside over slavery and Jim Crow, the halting of all non-white immigration to the United States, the Great Depression, the Depression of the 1870s, which was a 19-year-long depression, the internment of the Japanese Americans. It's not an entirely unblemished record, but you're right. They had some huge advantages, and I think the single biggest difference is that what we did was we took a essentially aristocratic elite and replaced it with a meritocratic elite. And the advantages of aristocracy are that people have, because they are so secure, this was true, by the way, of the Whig aristocracy in the 19th century in Britain as well, because they are so secure, they have the ability to have a kind of long-term proprietary interest in the society and not worry about their own standing in the short term. Averell Harriman knew he was going to be fine. That whether or not he got this particular job, or he was there because he thought he could do great projects. Paul Nitzer, these people were all immensely privileged and wealthy. Today, we have a much more meritocratic, but as a result, much more transactional and much more anxious elite. Everyone's hustling. Everyone's on a treadmill. Every CEO is worrying about quarterly earnings. You know, if you take that metaphor and think about it in terms of the elites in general, everyone has to maximize short-term advantage over the long term. And if you think about the great failures in the United States, I would say over the last 40 or 50 years, they have largely been that we have lost the ability to think long-term about the health of our society. Think about this country. Basically, with the exception of wars, we never ran debt and ran surpluses every year from the founding of the country through the Reagan administration. Since then, no matter what, we've racked up deficits. The only 2 or 3 years that didn't happen was the end of the Clinton era. Ironically, Bill Clinton is the kind of great WASP aristocrat in this story. But I think he did have that sense, partly because he felt the Democrats had been punished so much for being reckless and irresponsible. He wanted to restore their reputation for fiscal probity. And I think that makes it much more difficult to enact the smartest policies. I think there's another problem with it, which I imagine you think about a lot, which is the danger of a meritocracy is you can kind of think that you deserve to be where you are and that therefore the poor deserve to be where they are. At the end of the day, it's much more difficult for an Avril Harriman to think unkindly of the janitor, the groundsman in his estate in upstate New York, because he's there because he's a member of the Lucky Sperm Club. He's not there because he worked his ass off and went to Harvard and all that stuff. That was all a function of his aristocratic status. But when you have climbed up yourself through a meritocratic process, it's easy to imagine that, look, I did it all myself. Why can't these people? And I think that is deeply, deeply wrong and deeply troublesome as a society and immoral. Because the truth is, first of all, you have had all kinds of advantages you don't think about. You may have grown up in a stable family that had 2 parents that cared and loved you, which is a huge advantage. I mean, I think a mother's unqualified love for a child is probably the single greatest advantage anyone can confer on a child. You may have gotten, a good education because of a friend or a teacher. You may have gotten a lucky break along the way. A lot of life, a lot of our success, all of us in this room, is luck. And similarly, there are people who've had bad luck in life. And I think we have tended to have a somewhat unnecessarily cruel attitude towards people who are kind of at the bottom of society because of this meritocracy.
Yeah. How do you think about preparing people for leadership even national? I'm talking about mostly national leadership. I taught a course. I don't know if you went through it, grand strategy at Yale, and I taught it with 3 great historian thinkers: a guy named John Gaddis, Paul Kennedy, and a guy named Charlie Hill. And it was basically a great books class for people who we hoped would go on and take part in the foreign policy leadership of the country. I remember I took about 8 of the students out to drinks one night, and I said, "How many of you were high school presidents?" And every hand went up. They were that type. But it was a version of you train people to run the world, basically, by having them read Thucydides and Clausewitz. And I found that very useful. If you're about to go to war in Iraq, it really helps to have read Thucydides. But that class has now been taken away, and I'm not sure even the sense that we as Yaleys have responsibility for that kind of training. How would you create the next Jake Sullivan or the next, Tony Blinken?
Well, I do think it's very unfortunate that that education systems have become too multicultural and too relativistic. And what I mean by that is, and I say this as an Indian Muslim immigrant, the country has to have a core cultural canon. And this country is supremely a product of the Enlightenment. And it is inevitably going to draw on that tradition as part of what makes it cohere as a civilization. And so, if you start to say, well, we're just going to do everything, and there is no coherent cultural narrative that we can teach about this country, I think you lose something very important. You lose an awareness of it, you lose a pride in it, and you also lose a sense of narrative and direction. Like, where are we going? What is the story of the United States if you don't have that sense. My version of what you're describing is when I was getting my PhD at Harvard, I taught a class which was a required class for anyone who wanted to major in government, which is what Harvard calls political science. And it was a fantastic course. It was devised by a liberal and a conservative, a man and a woman, Judith Shklar and James Q. Wilson. And it was basically, you started with the theory of America, which was John Locke, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson. You read Calhoun, who was a very important part of the debate about it, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. And then about midpoint in the class, you stopped and you started to read court cases. And you read court cases from the 1880s, roughly, to the 1970s and 80s, when I was teaching it. And the idea was, here is the theory, and here is the practice of America. Here's how we conceived of this country, and here's how we imperfectly tried to apply these theories, because everybody, uniquely in this country looks back and asks themselves, what's the... And it was a brilliant course. And the kids, and the reason as a graduate student I was teaching it is because we only had classes of 7, so that it was all papers. I thought it was an amazing class. And of course, you can imagine what's happened. We were reading all dead white men. So guess what? If you now want to major at political science at Harvard, there are like 8 different modules you can do, and if you want to do, the history of the Incas, you can do that. If you want to do the history of feminism, you can. And there's nothing wrong with any of those subjects, but there was something to saying that we as Harvard University think that this is, a central intellectual experience that you have to grapple with and you have to go through. And if you're not going to go through it, you're not going to understand everything else about, that you are, centering it and you're having a perspective. And I think it's very unfortunate that we've lost a lot of that. And, I don't know, it does feel like blowing against the wind to say that we should bring it back. The other thing I do think is partly this issue of meritocracy is we got to do something that's more in the spirit of national service, because we really know so little about those other people, I think I am going to guess, without asking for a show of hands or anything, that if I were to ask the people in this room, how many people do you genuinely know as human beings who make less than $250,000 a year, whom you do not employ? That number would be very, very, very small. And at 250,000, I think I'm talking about that's 90% of America that you really don't know. Okay, and that's all of us. I don't pretend otherwise. And if you think about how can you have empathy? How can you understand? And by the way, the same is true for the other side as well. And I think that I remember reading about John F. Kennedy's PT boat once, and this is the boat he captains when he's in World War II that sinks. And they were talking about the people who made up that boat. And there was a plumber, there was a house painter, there was an artist of some kind, there was John F. Kennedy, the son of one of the richest men in the United States, there was a stockbroker's son, and they were all in this, and they were a team. And that sense of camaraderie that you sense people had who went through the war and even the draft during the Korean War and all that, I think that can only come, to your point, forcibly. People are not going to choose to be in those circumstances. So, my thought is universal service after high school, 1 to 2 years, and I gather that mandatory, there may be some constitutional problems. So you can heavily incentivize people. That's when you forgive student debt. That's when you have to do more than student debt, because you want to get at the people who may not be going to college. So you want to give them real stipends. So you have to make it a very attractive inducement, but I think you can also put in some penalties as well. And if you did that, I feel like so much of our challenge is, just having some degree of empathy for the other. We live such different lives. And technology and economics, it's pushing us all in, if you think AI is going to double and triple this problem, of the kind of bifurcation of these worlds. And so we need something, and this is where government can play a role, right? Like we bring people together, even if technology and economics and geography is pushing people apart.
Okay, let's turn to the floor. If anybody has questions, we do have 2 mic runners running up and down the mic. And if anybody, all I ask is you make your questions long and rambling with no question at the end.
Thank you for this wonderful program. I just have to say from your last comment that our entire government makes less than $250,000, and it's a real shame. And I think it's a lot of the problems that we have, that they're so underpaid. So I'd like to hear your comment about that.
Well, I entirely agree, but I feel like that is so difficult to imagine in an age of populism where everyone thinks that government is, if you want to look at the least corrupt country in the world, it's Singapore. And why? Because, and I talked to the founder, Lee Kuan Yew, about this many, many times. He became a friend of mine. And he said, I looked at every third world country, and I looked at people, and I saw that these were good people, these corrupt bureaucrats and corrupt politicians. But they wanted a way that they could save for their retirement, that they could send their children to good schools, that they could feel some degree of security, which is an impulse that everybody has. And I thought, well, why not make it unnecessary to be corrupt, to do that? So a cabinet minister in Singapore today makes about $1.5 million. They have a complicated benchmarking system where they benchmark against the private sector, and you don't make as much by any means, but they kind of look at, okay, what would a McKinsey consultant make, and we'll pay, 40 or 50%. So there's a benchmarking where you are paying for the privilege of public service, but you're making enough that you can save for your retirement, you can buy your own house, you can send your kids to a nice place. You don't feel that, you have to do these transactions. And then on the other side, they are incredibly strict about. So by doing both, he said, everyone looks at them with, the zero tolerance stuff. And he said, but that's the key, is that you also make it so that people can live decent lives.
This is dated information, but I think it used to be the most highly paid federal employee was the football coach at West Point, and making many millions. So when we really care about something, we do pay for it.
Well, the coach at Duke, I think, makes literally 15 times what the president makes.
Ma'am? Let's go here and then we'll go there.
Okay, it's really thrilling to be in the presence of you brilliant 2 guys. I think, however, that this topic is it's a misnomer. We're not living in revolutionary times. We're living in sad, scary, horrific, in my opinion, pre-war Germany times. And David has a panel on happiness coming up. In order for me to be able to live until that panel, I would like to hear from each of you one hopeful thing other than new leaders, which you mentioned, and the wishful thing of service, which I agree with.
David, you go first.
My quick hopeful thing is if you take all of America's problems and write them on a legal pad, and then you write on the other side of the legal pad, America has more talent than ever before. My point was column B is more important than column A. And that there's a reason why America is still the source of AI, the source of these medical breakthroughs. And we attract a great number of extremely smart and energetic people who are solving problems. And to reduce it to economics, our economy is the strongest in the world right now. To reduce it to social trust and moral cohesiveness, got no good news for you there.
So again, maybe our perspectives are a little different, because I grew up in a very traditional society where, family ties were deeply important. The divorce rate was under 1%. People often say to me, why is the divorce rate in India so low? And honestly, I do think the simple answer is lots of women are miserable. You can. When I think of community, I sometimes want to reach for an oxygen mask, because I remember how stifling community can be, how hierarchical, how it denies you dignity as an individual, how it denies you choice. And so I think America is one of the greatest experiments in the history of the world. We are trying to do the hardest thing in the world, which is incorporate everybody into the great experiment of America. Make everyone feel seen and heard, and whether you're black or white and Latino, whether you're gay, whether you're trans, and we overdo it, and we do stupid things, and we make distinctions that are not that important, and we lose common sense in doing all that. But think of the spirit of where it comes from. What we're trying to make sure is that nobody is sitting there thinking, I don't count, and that I can't be seen for who I am, I don't have to play act being somebody else. I don't have to assimilate into somebody else's idea of what it means to be human. And I think one of the reasons we have this incredible innovation machine is directly a product of that. You can be in America and you can be yourself more than you can be in any country in the world. And I think, it's a rough, complicated struggle, and there are people who find it deeply disconcerting. I mean, one of the reasons I think we have so much turmoil is because of the single most important thing we've done in the last 40 years, in my opinion, is women's equality and liberation. Think about human history. For all of human history, you had one tribe on top and one tribe at the bottom, and the tribe on top beat up the tribe on the bottom. This is the story of human history. But through all those thousands of years, one group was always at the bottom, women. Until 200 years ago, in pretty much every society in the world, women were the property of men in some fundamental, deeply important legal sense, okay? Listen to what I'm saying. In the last 40 years, in the Western world particularly, we have fundamentally changed that. And we're not there yet. There's a lot of work to do. There are things that are moves back. But if you think about how powerful and important that is, it's extraordinary. But now think about how disruptive it is. This is the basic unit of social life. And you have taken the power dynamic within it, which used to be highly hierarchical, and made it egalitarian. It's going to piss a lot of people off. And they can't say that they're pissed off. They can say they're disconcerted and they're anxious and they're uneasy. There's not an accident that every deeply religious nationalist movement in the world right now, the first thing they want to do is put the women back in the kitchen. If you look at the Islamic fundamentalists, if you look at the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, if you look at Christian nationalism, Xi Jinping just gave a speech recently, because I think of him as he's a neoconservative, basically, on cultural issues. He says women need to find a new definition of feminism that allows them to have kids, that allows them to look after the family, that allows them to create and sustain a proper home. So he's trying to get women back in the kitchen, because they all see that this is a deeply revolutionary force. So I think that, you're going to get pushback, but don't mistake the undertow for the wave. We are moving forward.
Okay. Right here.
Thank you. This has been deeply moving, and you've given me permission to plug my social enterprise. So my name is Dr. Nana Fominin. I am a recovering ER doctor. For the last 10 years, I have been seeing what's deeply wrong with our health system as I interface with our community. And so 2018, we built Shared Harvest, with this empathy-driven technology to elevate the culture of volunteering while eliminating student loan debt. And we were so in line with what was happening on the ground. Like you said, those people who were $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year doing the impact work, doing the work in the community for social justice and health equity, that was before the pandemic. And then seeing how they actually went and activated after the pandemic and during the pandemic to save the lives of their neighbors, where our health systems were failing them. And then when I saw half of my health professionals who were first generation, who were college students, first generation, or first generation doctors, who were deeply felt betrayed by the medical system because they were out there doing the work, but they're also worrying about people who look like them who were dying in the hospital. And I came out of that, and I was plucked out of that to be at the Harvard Kennedy School to focus on minority health policy, which was I've been doing the last year. And I thought I was taking a sabbatical year until I ended up at Harvard during this mayhem of a year. And this was not a sabbatical year, but what it was a year to see how much apathy was there injected and empathy was lost. So my question to you is, what is the next best step to get into a national service? Because I think that is what preserves empathy between each other and a better understanding. But it's not looking at the pie at the sky. What is the next best step now? And examples of that would be great.
Congress could legislate this. This is not impossible. This is something Al Gore proposed when he was running for president. There are certain, constraints. You can't do exactly a mandatory forced national service, but I think you could incentivize. I think the key is at every level, can we do something to incentivize people to come together across these class, cultural, regional divisions, income divisions? At least that's my feeling. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. Chris Coons is a senator from Delaware who works on this more or less 60% of the time. And he's one of Joe Biden's best friends. There are blocks. The Republicans don't want to do it because of spending, and some of the Democratic groups don't want to do it because it might compete with labor. So there are interest groups you have to buck. But I will say, you mentioned national service, and you heard applause. I find that's universally true no matter what kind of audience you're talking to.
Yeah.
And so it's just an obvious solution. We are out of time, unfortunately. So let us thank Fareed Zakaria.
David, you're very kind.